I welcome all of you. It is a pleasure this evening to be co-hosting this event. We are co-hosting this event with CCL, the Citizens Climate Lobby, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to bring together experts from a variety of fields to talk about issues that are important to all of us. I would like to welcome alumni and students and members of the Delaware community. We are being taped, and so alumni can watch this at their leisure. I would also like to ask if you are interested. We have a sign-in sheet at the back. We also have a bowl that you can leave your business card. So both the center, the university, and CCL would like to contact you if you are interested, so please give us your information as you leave. It is my pleasure to introduce to you at this time the provost of our university, who happens to have majored in botany and chemistry here at Ohio Wesleyan University. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Chuck Steinmetz.
Please don't hold those majors against me. Rock Jones, our president, was unable to be here this evening. I know he's would love to have heard this panel this evening. And so he asked me just to welcome you on behalf of the institution. So welcome. We're really pleased to have you here this evening for the Environmental and Natural Resource Symposium. I know we're going to have a really great panel. I had a chance to spend some time with one of them over dinner, so we got him warmed up, so he'll come out gunning here at the beginning. And then finally, I just would like to take a moment to thank those that helped to make this evening possible. The Volmati Center, the Economics Department, and then what I understand is one of the newest chapters of Citizens for Climate Lobby, the Delaware chapter of the CCL. So please join me in thanking those groups for this evening. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Lori Anderson, and invite the others up to the panel.
Welcome, everyone. I thought it might be appropriate to open our event this evening with a quote from the January 17th, 2015 edition of The Economist magazine. So let me read a short passage for you here. Politicians, for the most part, have refused to raise taxes on fossil fuels in recent years, on the grounds that making driving or heating homes more expensive would not only annoy voters, but also hurt the economy. With petrol and natural gas getting cheaper by the day, that excuse is gone. Higher taxes would encourage conservation, dampen future price swings, and provide a more sensible way for governments to raise money. An obvious starting point is to target petrol. Even better would be a tax on carbon. Burning fossil fuels harms the health of both the planet and its inhabitants. Taxing carbon would nudge energy firms and consumers toward using cleaner fuels. As fuel prices fall, a carbon tax is becoming less politically daunting. So our message to politicians is a simple one: seize the day. I am sharing this quote with you to emphasize that carbon taxes are a significant focus in the international conversation about strategies to reduce fossil fuel emissions. And tonight, we're inviting our community to take an active part in this very interesting discussion. While the role of carbon emissions in climate change may be an important motivation for a carbon tax discussion, I want to emphasize that our goal here tonight is not to explore the scientific evidence for climate change, which begs the point, why am I here? I am a natural scientist. I work on climate issues and plant involvement in climate change. But I'm also the chair of the Sustainability Task Force here at Ohio Wesleyan, and I have a lot of interest in exploring diverse, interdisciplinary environmental solutions, or solutions to environmental problems. So I'm here tonight because I am excited to explore the carbon tax strategy with two experts who can lead us through the finer points of the economic viability of this kind of policy, and to emphasize the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation in exploring environmental problems. I have found that very often scientists are in the role of describing the problem, but the solutions lie in other disciplines, such as political science, sociology, psychology, and of course, economics. So let me introduce our economics experts to you now. Scott Nystrom received his BA in History, BS in Economics, and his MA in Economic History from Iowa State University. He has worked at Regional Economic Modeling, Inc., or REMI, since 2011, and he is the head of software training, support, and economic consulting in the Washington, D.C. office. Mr. Nystrom works with an international range of clients in state governments, provincial authorities, federal departments, consulting firms, academic institutions, and nonprofit research organizations. His project highlights include impact analyses of the fiscal cliff and federal sequestration, the Trans-Canada Keystone XL pipeline, the $5 billion long-range outlook for Southern California Association of Governments, Medicaid expansion in North Carolina, and carbon taxes in Massachusetts, Washington, California, and the United States as a whole. What we'll do this evening is have Mr. Nystrom go first and present his modeling work on a carbon fee and dividend policy that is of great interest to the Citizens Climate Lobby. And it is described also in a report that has been presented on Capitol Hill and many other venues. Then we will hear from Dr. Ian Sheldon on some of the issues that surround competitiveness in international trade with a domestic carbon tax in place. Dr. Sheldon is the Anderson's Professor of International Trade in the Department of Agriculture, Environmental, and Development Economics at The Ohio State University. Dr. Sheldon received his PhD in economics from the University of Salford in the UK. He served as a lecturer in economics at the University of Exeter in the UK before becoming a professor at Ohio State. He has published widely in the fields of economics and agricultural economics with a focus on trade and policy issues. He was previously the editor of the American Journal of Agricultural Economics and currently serves as a featured articles editor for Applied Economics Perspectives and Policy. After both speakers are done, I will pose one or two questions for them to discuss in a panel format, and then we will invite questions from the audience. I want to remind you when we get to this audience phase of the question to wait until a microphone is available to you before you ask your question. So please welcome as our first speaker, Mr. Scott Nystrom.
Evening, everybody. So now you get to actually hear from the economists in this one. And before I go into this, I want everyone to have one quote in mind. 1947, or at least this somewhat apocryphal version of the story is from 1947. Harry Truman's president, and he's not doing too well. The Korean War is bogging down. The United States is going through a pretty hefty, deep recession coming out of World War II. There was a cool-off recession that was actually deeper than both the Great Recession and the recession in 1983. It's the biggest one we've actually had since 1931. So his prospects aren't going exactly well, and he's going to be up for a re-election soon. And I think maybe somebody's giggling over here because he maybe knows this story. But this story kind of tells you everything you need to know about the field of economics. Is Harry Truman's dealing with his economic advisors, trying to get the economy going again and all this stuff. And eventually he gets kind of frustrated with them. He says basically, whenever I talk to these dang economists, he's a good Missouri boy, you know, I have to have a little bit of that in there, I always get on the one hand and on the other hand. What I wouldn't give for a one-handed economist. So what I'm going to show you this evening is not meant to be a one-handed economist. There are costs and there are benefits to what I'm showing you, but it does reframe the climate energy debate a little bit in ways that we maybe hadn't talked about previously. So what I'm going to do is give kind of an abbreviated version of a presentation I've given several times. It was the keynote address for CCL's national conference a couple months ago. I think it was June last year, maybe July. I'm not going to be able to go through every little detail to it just because I only have about 20 minutes to do this, but I do want to give you all a high-level approach of what this is. So very quickly, that's me. REMI is a little software company that's based in Massachusetts. It's an outgrowth of the University of Massachusetts. What I'm being done in this case is I'm basically almost a private sector CBO. That is, CCL has approached me with a policy idea. In this case, it's a carbon fee and dividend. And they asked me to score it objectively in terms of what it would mean for the economy and the emissions in the power sector. So that's what I've done here. So what I'm going to do for you all in the next 18 minutes or so is talk about what that idea is in a lot of detail, and then go very quickly over what our modeling and our suggestions had it would actually mean. I can't go through everything in detail. This report is on their website. There's a 120-something page PDF. I should know. I wrote it over Memorial Day weekend last year. That has fuller details. So if you're curious about that, CCL REMI report, and it's very easy to find. So before any of that, we'll just go into the idea. So it's a three-step process. I'm going to start from the very scratch. The idea is a carbon price, or a carbon tax, or a carbon fee. I'm going to use the terminology interchangeably here, but CCL has presumed that there is a worldwide problem that is involved with emitting carbon into the atmosphere, that it causes disruptions to the existing climate system that would have negative effects on human welfare, productivity, prosperity, whatever you want to define it as. I'm actually both personally and professionally agnostic on the issue of climate change, simply because, one, I'm not educated in it. I'm not a physical scientist. They kicked me out of the Marston College of Engineering at Iowa State, so I'm not going to try to go back into those kind of things. But it is an interesting economic problem, because unlike a lot of environmental issues like CFCs or other types of particulate air pollution, it isn't something you can source to just a handful of industrial processes or a handful of particular products or sources. Carbon dioxide is ubiquitous throughout the economy. It's a fundamental part of all human economic activity, at least all modern human economic activity. Therefore, it has to be addressed economically and macroeconomically. So I'm coming at it from that perspective first and foremost. And the modeling I've done here actually has no climate feedback, quote unquote. It doesn't include any effects on world climate systems. So this is purely a tax study. This is purely an economic study. So the idea is we price it. Anything that's more expensive, you get less of. It's just basic Econ 101, a price response. If something is more expensive, people will buy less of something. The way they would price it is up there. It's the second gold bullet point. It's at the well or the mine. That is, as this stuff is pulled out of the ground, gas, coal, and oil, or it's brought into the United States on a pipe or a ship, there's a price applied to it. It's $10 a year, then so 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, escalates at a linear rate and goes through at least 200. That's the end of my time horizon, 2035. Just to give a benchmark for everyone on what that means, $10 a year, math works out such that $10 a ton is about 9 or maybe closer to 10 cents per gallon of gasoline. So if gas is now 4, I'm just picking a flat number here, 410, 420, 430, 440, and eventually people would change their behavior in response to that. You take 100% of this money and you put it into a fund that is then distributed to all American households, basically on a per capita concept, not quite. You can see there's a little bit of a reservation there for family size, but more or less on a per capita basis. So if there's 320 million Americans, there roughly are, and I'm discounting that child adjustment, we'd all get 1/320 millionth of the funds every month that come in from this. This has no eligibility requirements. The only thing you need to get it is basically a Social Security number. And something like a Social Security Administration, which already mails out or deposits directly about 150 million checks a month anyways, would be probably in charge of doing something like this. This may seem kind of strange because there's no eligibility requirements. It creates what a welfare economist would call a guaranteed income or a minimum basic income or something like that. But there's actually one state that does this. The Alaska Permanent Fund. They don't call it a carbon price, they call it a royalty or a severance tax, but they tax it as it comes out of the ground, they put it into a sovereign wealth fund. Alaska's different because it's actually a fund, it's invested, it generates a capital income. This is straight rebate, so there's no interest on it basically, or very minimal interest on it, but it's the same basic idea what Alaska does, only it's benchmarked to a carbon tax, it's benchmarked to a carbon price for carbon emissions, and it's rebated monthly to everybody. And it's not invested, and then basically Alaska gives you just the profit off the fund. This gives you everything. That would bring, in theory, this is actually point 3. Well, just point 3 before we go too far. Point 3 is that people would rightfully say that this might have a negative effect on American competitiveness because this increases energy costs. theoretically you could just use cheaper foreign substitutes that could be replacing American production and commodities. The other issue too is that if this climate and global warming thing is truly an issue, it's a global issue. It's the perfect tragedy of the commons. Everybody owns the atmosphere equally. Nobody controls it and everybody controls it. Therefore, if the United States does something on its own, and emissions are just moved someplace else in the world and re-imported back in the United States, it's not going to help anything. So the border adjustment idea, and I don't think this originates with CCL, but this is just as important as the other two, is imagine there's a piece of steel. Steel is a very carbon-intensive commodity because it does require coal for coking purposes, and this part of the country is the part of the country that makes those kind of commodities: Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania. That piece of steel, say it costs this much. Just imagine my little graph here. Now we put the carbon price on and it costs this much. So theoretically, without a border adjustment, you could flood the market with cheap Chinese or German or Indian imports and drive American producers out of business. But with the border adjustment, what would happen is as soon as that foreign product got to the port of Baltimore or the port of LA Long Beach or whatever it is, it would have the same price that's put on American goods put on it. And simplifying international trade theory a little bit, but what matters is relative prices, not absolute prices. If therefore American prices have went up and foreign prices have went up, they haven't changed relative to each other, the American position in the market is relatively unchanged. You take the money from that and use it to rebate exporters so they can maintain their export position. So imagine you have a bushel of grain or bushel of corn from Wisconsin being sold in New Orleans for a feedlot in Argentina. That would have the carbon tax on it rebated when it leaves the United States, so it maintains its position in the export market just as much as we maintain our position in the domestic market. Those two things at the bottom actually balance each other out pretty nicely in terms of revenue in and cost out. This is also sometimes alternatively called a border tariff. Paul Krugman actually had an article where he called it a carbon tariff. There's several different things it's been called, but that's the main idea of it. This serves three purposes. One, it in theory preserves American competitiveness. We're not opening our economy up to cheap imports. Two, it means that there's no advantage to placing business activity overseas relative to before, so you're not just making the emissions go someplace else. And three, it's a transmission mechanism. The United States is the largest consumption economy in the world. We're no longer the largest economy. According to every source I've seen, China's GDP is actually larger than ours now for a couple months. But we still have by far the largest consumption class, and we have by far the biggest wealthy and middle class in the world. Which means if anybody wants to grow, we're the biggest export market. So you kind of have to play our game if you want to sell and do business here, and we're the biggest market to do business in. We're still we're a consumption-oriented economy. China's an export-oriented economy. Just one anecdote of this is I was at the World Bank with some CCL members, and one of their Canadian economists, I showed him this to them, and he said something to the effect of, if the United States ever did something like this, we would have to match it instantaneously, so we wouldn't have to deal with a border adjustment, because otherwise our exports would be at risk. And something like 30% of Canada's economy is business done with the United States. So it becomes a transmission mechanism where other countries can have their border adjustment equalized or forgiven if they have a similar system in place or a similar price in place. So that's the idea of it. I'm not a tax attorney. I don't know if this is necessarily legal under WTO rules or not. It's my understanding, though, from some CCL report or some discussion that as long as a tariff like this is not discriminatory, if it's based on an environmental adjustment, there is an exception under GATT and WTO rules where therefore it actually is allowable. I'm not going to say other exporting countries that necessarily like it, but supposedly something like this, if it's non-discriminatory, is allowed under international trade laws, so therefore it would get through the relevant international agencies. So that's our idea. 3 steps. I'm going to run through very quickly what this does to the economy and emissions and everything else as a consequence. I'm going to skip all the methodology stuff simply because I don't have time to go through it and go straight to results. One point I will make, though, is that because REMI is regional modeling, we do the United States as constituent parts. There's a lot of modeling and a lot of policy analysts and discussion out there that treats the United States as a consistent whole. And for those of you who came to that session I did for students this afternoon, you know the answer, so be quiet. I'm sorry for scaring you all, by the way. One state in the United States actually had a recession last year. Does anybody know what it is? It's Connecticut. Nobody would have guessed that just off the top of your head, but it's not unusual, even in a quote-unquote good year, for anywhere from 1 to 5 of the states to have a recession. So it's done by constituent parts because there's so much variability in demographics, culture, geography, industry mixture, energy usage between the states. So remember that colors, that red color, Great Lakes states, is maybe the one to be looking at for you all. What? Sorry. So, results. It actually generates more jobs to have this system in place. That is, tax carbon dioxide in the way I described, rebate the dollars on that what more or less per capita basis, and have the border adjustment. More jobs. Why, I'll get to in a second. But notice that it's not equal. There's a couple of regions that are better than others, and there's one region, that light blue color at the bottom for West, South, Central, that's actually negative. That's Texas and Oklahoma, so the big oil states in the southern and western parts of the country. Probably not a shocker, they're on the lower end of this. But notice it's not like tremendous, catastrophically negative. It's 50,000 in a region that has 40 million people. National employment is about 2 million to 3 million. This may seem like a lot, but if you put it in context of the whole United States economy, there's about 180 million jobs in the United States, so it's about 1%, given that there'll be about 200 million some point in the future with population growth. GDP, same result, mostly positive, but notice that the kind of the distribution has shifted itself downwards. It's not as positive as it was beforehand, and that Texas-Oklahoma region is more negative. Put this in context percentage-wise, and now you're still getting a more negative effect. So jobs and GDP went up. Kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but the reason GDP is going up more than anything else is import displacement. This country imports a lot of petroleum, crude petroleum from Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Nigeria, not so much anymore the Middle East, but we have historically. Every time you fill up a car, you fill up a pump, about 75 cents of that is the actual fuel. Therefore, that's money that's leaving this country. If you are to decrease the want of it and to keep the dollars kicking around the United States, you've increased GDP. It's import displacement. The reason jobs has went up has to do with industry mixture. So go to this one here. So here's jobs by industry. The whole oil and gas fossil fuel supply chain, just going through it very quickly, there's 400,000 jobs in power generation in the United States. There's about 100,000 in long-haul pipeline. There's about 700,000 in oil and gas extraction, so that's like Texas and North Dakota and Alaska. There's about 100,000 jobs in the refining industry, and there's about 75,000 or so jobs in the coal mining industry. Does anybody know how many jobs there are in the healthcare industry in this country? Anyone? It's about 22 million. That is, the oil gas supply chain in total is something like, depending on what you count or not, but it's between 1 and 2 million jobs. Yeah. So essentially, if you have a refinery and a hospital right next to each other, there's not that many jobs at the refinery, and there's dozens, if not hundreds or thousands, at a hospital that has the same money put through it. It has to do with the labor intensity of industry and the economy. Energy as a sector is capital and equipment intensive. General consumer spending, everything else, is more labor intensive. So we basically meant that there's more jobs available. They maybe don't necessarily pay quite as well. You're having a smaller number of very high-paying jobs in those sectors, but you're having more general jobs across the whole of the economy. Emissions, I'm not going to dwell on it, but you all kind of take your context here. It basically reduces them by a third to a half within 20 years. Revenues, it's hundreds of billions. It's a lot of money very quickly. The dividend, depending on your family size, and this is monthly, not annually, but it's between $50 and $400 eventually in the longer term. Skip these ones. And then this one really quickly for the power sector. We used a power model to do some of this stuff, where the stuff on the left is without the carbon price, the stuff on the right is with the carbon price. Going through the colors really quickly, blue is coal, red is nuclear, orange is gas, the white color at the top is hydro, the lime green color is wind, and the gold color is solar. So the current situation is coal and gas are a large part of our power mixture. Nuclear is declining because the existing fleet will retire eventually. And what's replacing it for the most part is new gas. Gas prices are very low. They're typically anticipated to stay that way. So that's the current situation. You put the carbon price on, coal is not competitive on the market because of the internal carbon price. So the coal plants are shut down, and they're replaced by a mixture of wind and solar at the top, Wind and solar, though, are intermittent. They do turn themselves on and off. So there'll be backup in the form of storage, in the form of nuclear plants, in the form of hydroelectric dams, in the form of gas plants, just depending on where in the country. There's a lot more discussion and information on this in the paper. I just want to get the high-level one out there, is that this changes the electricity market in fundamental ways, but notice it's in a way that reduces carbon emissions significantly. And also improves air quality. This methodology, just very quickly, is according to WHO, there's about 30,000 deaths in the United States every year because of ambient air quality. Half of all emissions of various asthmatic and cancer-causing compounds basically come from coal plants. I'm simplifying greatly there. So if you take the coal plants out, you reduce emissions from tailpipes and smokestacks, you would expect that there'd be a lot fewer premature deaths of asthmatic conditions and respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses as a consequence. That's this number here. And that's by and large what I wanted to get to. There's the high-level results of it. Again, the reason it's positive is import displacement. World gross product, here's my one harmed, other harmed thing. The size of the world economy is smaller in these simulations, just implicitly. But because the United States is not importing as much petroleum as it used to, our share of it is larger, therefore our economy is larger, and there's more jobs because the type of industries and the type of consumer spending that's take place generates more jobs because of the type of task. It's difficult, if not impossible, to automate healthcare or finance or retail jobs in some instances, while most production occupations, like output of manufacturing in the United States, has not declined in the last 30, 40 years. It's just employment has, because we're using machines instead of people. This moves the economy towards some more people-oriented industries. Therefore, that's where you get the more jobs. So that's my high-level stuff. Here's just some kind of meta points that I'll leave up for some later discussion. I maybe went a little over on time, sorry. Okay, and we'll get to questions after that, so thank you all.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me up here yet again. Some people in the audience I'm very familiar with. The last time I was here was in November talking about macroeconomic issues. So in case you're confused, I'm not really a macroeconomist. I'm a trade economist. But I'm a trade economist who's taught little bits and pieces of environmental economics for many, many years, both when I was a professor in Exeter University back in the UK, and I've been teaching basic externalities and what policies we should use towards pollution for many, many years down at Ohio State. I also have a background in what's called industrial organization. So at the very end of my presentation, I may talk a little bit about some of my recent research on thinking about climate policy in the context of actually the aluminum industry, and I'll come back to explain why I've done a little bit of work on the aluminum industry. I was originally just going to talk about my work on the intersection between trade policy and environmental policy, because that's really what I'm doing my research on at the moment. But Marianne over here, I know this because Laurie sent us the set of questions that you were interested in maybe us trying to answer. So what I thought I'd do is put a little bit of what Scott has done in a context of what are the policy choices that you can pick on to deal with carbon emissions, and why do some economists think you should use one kind of policy, and why do others argue you should use other kinds of policy, and then think about it in an international context, because Scott has already referred to this idea that if the US were to unilaterally implement a climate tax, you have this issue of leakage and competitiveness, which is the issue that I've been thinking about long before this became an issue in the climate debate. I was working on this in relation to the CFC case, actually, about 10 years ago when I first started thinking about this. So I'm going to actually try to answer some of Marianne's questions that she asked us to think about. Maybe I'm preempting questions that Laurie was going to ask. I'm going to put a few things that Scott said into context, not because we're going to have, Scott says one thing and I'm going to say another. I mean, it's a truism that you probably do want a one-handed economist in the room. But I want to point out some things that you have to be careful with the kind of modeling exercise he's done, where you may be pushing the model too hard in terms of the kind of the size of the carbon tax that you're implementing. Because you can do as much damage economically by having too high a tax as too low a tax. So with that said, does this work? Yep, there we go. So as you get older, you get blinder, so I have to put my glasses on. So we were having this discussion over dinner about why would you want to tax carbon? And the deep insight here goes back to an economist called Pigou, who was actually a contemporary of Keynes at Cambridge in the 1920s, and which is why we actually call carbon taxes, their correct name in the literature is a Pigouvian tax. And what Pigou never called it that. I mean, he had a book called The Economics of Welfare, but buried in there was this idea that, and his example, his famous example was of railroads in Britain with steam engines, steam locomotives, running through rural areas and sparks coming out of the smokestack and setting fire to farmers' fields. And the idea was that uncompensated damage was being done by one person's economic activity to somebody else's economic activity. Well, it took us about another 100 years to figure out that the problem it's a problem of missing markets. So think about the environment that production entities, or you as consumers when you drive your cars, you're using the environment as an input into either your consumption activity or your production activity. And the problem is that typically think of it as an input if you're a producer, this input's not priced in the market. And so you have a problem of missing markets. Now, Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize maybe 15 years ago, Ronald Coase's great insight was, as long as you have property rights, well-defined property rights, you don't have a missing market problem, because you can trade the right to a clean environment or the right to dirty the environment in markets. So Coase has been sort of misinterpreted in my opinion. Coase wasn't saying markets would work. Coase was pointing out the conditions under which markets won't work. And we have missing markets largely because of property rights failures. Who owns I mean, as Scott correctly pointed out, the environment is a public good. And it suffers from the tragedy of the commons, that it's not priced and it gets overused. So the reason economists, and this has been long understood from the 1950s when environmental economics sort of started coming of age, was how do we resolve this problem that there are inputs, the environment, are not being priced. So of course economists think straight away, let's put a price on it. And so the debate over carbon taxes versus cap and trade, and I'll give you a little bit of a flavor for what these two policies actually stand for, is really about how best to mimic market solutions. So if you believed in the Coasean bargain argument that if you have property rights, there's no transactions costs, there's perfect information, right? Markets should work. I mean, what the Coase theorem, as it's called, is a tautology. If you have all the conditions for markets, markets work. So what economists are saying is if you don't have all the conditions for markets, you need to somehow mimic markets. And so a carbon tax, which is essentially what Scott has in his model, is if firms want to emit CO2, carbon dioxide, or if we as consumers, as we drive our car up here to Delaware this evening, if we want to emit CO2, we should be directly charged a price. And that price is going to be set by the policymaker. Okay, so think of a carbon tax or a carbon fee is simply a price for an input, the environment. So when you emit carbon, you're damaging the environment, you're using up the clean environment, so you have to pay for it. Okay? And it's getting at the idea that when you produce something, you should fully account for all the costs that you impose on society, as well as the private costs you incur as a producer when you produce that good. And that's why in economics we talk about private costs and social costs. And social costs should include all the costs of any economic activity. Now, cap and trade, which is, if you know your politics on this, the Waxman-Markey bill, which was the bill that went through the House of Representatives in the first 2 years of the first Obama administration, would have put in place a cap and trade system here in the United States. Now, the bill that was going through the Senate, sponsored by Kerry and Boxer, fell foul of the 2010 midterm elections. And since then, I guess climate policy has been pretty much a dirty word here in the US. And that's why Obama is using EPA regulations on air quality to just sort of implement standards by government fiat in the system. So in cap and trade, you don't set a price directly. You cap emissions of CO2, and you can ratchet down that cap. So Scott gets his, decline in CO2 emissions. What you do with a cap and trade system is you might map out a decline in emissions like that and say, in the first year we're going to have emissions at this level, and we're going to progressively ratchet it down. We have great experience of that kind of system here in the US. That's how we dealt with SO2 emissions. We had cap and trade in the sulfur dioxide market, and that market no longer exists anymore because it was so successful. Now, the way this works is that firms are required to have emissions permits. So there's a fixed amount of emissions, you have a certain amount of permits, and the key issue is how you give these permits out, how you distribute the permits. And I'm a trade economist, and so this is not a new problem. In international economics, we have a similar problem. Do you tax imports at the border and generate tariff revenue, or do you have a quota on imports? Now, the way an economist would say you should deal with a quota is you should auction the right to the quota. So the government raises the same amount of revenue, it's just a different way of managing the level of imports. A cap and trade versus a carbon tax is exactly the same argument. You're using a direct price like a tariff, or you're limiting the amount of carbon, and then the issue becomes how do you distribute the right to pollute, the carbon permits. And typically, the way this works, and it would have worked this way in the US, I believe, and I think this is the way it works in the EU, is firms get permits for free. You hand out permits to firms who want to pollute. And of course, they get fewer and fewer permits over time as you ratchet down the cap. And this is what's called free allocation, or you don't necessarily allocate all of them for free, but you allocate many of them for free, or you initially allocate them for free. The problem with that is you don't generate any income. You get a carbon permit, you have to cut back your pollution if you don't want to pollute over the permit, so firms incur what's called abatement costs, but they don't pay taxes, like a carbon tax, to the government. So this is actually a better policy from the standpoint of firms. It's cheaper for firms to meet a cap and trade system than it is a carbon tax. Now, if you were to auction off the permits, in theory, you should generate exactly the same result as a carbon tax, which is what this next bullet says. So a carbon price, a carbon tax, in principle would generate the same price as you would get in an auction. And if you allow firms to trade permits, and the way a cap and trade, the cap is the cap on the emissions, you give out the permits, and then you allow firms, maybe firms with lower abatement costs, to sell their permits to firms who have higher abatement costs. And so the price in the permit market, in theory, should end up being the same as a carbon tax if you set the carbon tax correctly, or the same as an auction price for if you auctioned off the permits. So in an auction market, dirtier firms are going to be willing to pay a higher price for permits than cleaner firms. So a trading market or an auction, in principle, should end up generating the same set of prices. So the argument is that firms would have the same kind of incentives to reduce their abatement costs under any system, a carbon tax, cap and trade with permit trading, or cap and trade where you auction the permits. The big difference is the distributional implications. And by distributional implications, I mean essentially how much revenue is raised by the different policies and who incurs the costs of those policies. So as I said, the cap and trade system, if permits are given out for free, the only cost that firms incur is the cost of cutting back pollution to meet the cap. Under a carbon tax system, you have to pay the tax on the pollution that you generate, and you would cut back pollution to avoid paying higher taxes. That's the standard argument. So the costs of complying with cap and trade are lower. So firms politically would lobby for a cap and trade system as opposed to a carbon tax. And they certainly wouldn't like auctions because the government would capture all the revenues and it would just end up back in the public exchequer just like a tax. So cap and trade only generates revenue if some or all of the permits are auctioned off. If they're given out for free. Firms then trade them privately, right? So it's firms, private firms, that sell permits that generate the benefit from the revenues, not the government or the consumer or the taxpayer. Now, one of the other important arguments about either of these policies, either taxes or permit auctions, is if they raise revenue, and Scott's model generates revenue, is that there's a big debate in the economics literature about what's called the possibility that you generate a double dividend. So, and Scott has a double dividend type of argument in his paper later on in the paper, but you don't call it the double dividend. So the argument is as follows. Let's suppose you have to raise a certain amount of revenue to pay for what we call public goods in economics. So public goods are things like roads, for example. The military is a public good. Public goods are goods that we can all consume. My consumption doesn't affect your consumption. You can't exclude others from consuming it. Okay? And the environment is a public good in that sense. My consumption of the environment doesn't affect your consumption of the environment until we get to biological limits. So you have to generate a certain amount of revenue. And the problem with any tax system is it potentially is distorting. By distorting, I mean it affects incentives if it's an income tax. It affects consumption behavior if it's a consumption tax. Now, in a perfect world, you use what we call lump sum taxes. It doesn't affect incentives. Bingo, no problem. Because as Mrs. Thatcher found out, lump sum taxes don't always work. The poll tax we had in Britain was a lump sum tax. It was massively regressive. You had public riots in the streets, and we got rid of it. So you have to use distorting taxes. Now, the argument as to why there's a double dividend here is with a carbon tax, what are you doing? You are solving the market failure, the missing market. But at the same time, you're raising revenue, which can be used to pay for public goods. Now, I don't know whether you have public goods in your model, but there's a possibility that you would use revenue to pay for public goods. The double dividend comes about because instead of raising revenue through income taxes or commodity goods sales taxes, you generate the necessary income through the carbon tax. Now, this is not about growing the economy like you get in your model. This is about a more efficient way of solving two market failures, pollution and supply of public goods, and reducing market failures through distorting income taxes. Now, there's a huge debate about whether there really is a double dividend. And for every economist in the room who says there is, you'll find one who says there isn't, because my utility function is different to yours, my labor supply function is different to yours, I use different parameters to calibrate my model. But there is a debate out there about whether a carbon tax generates this thing called a double dividend. You solve an environmental problem, you get rid of a distorting tax elsewhere, and you raise the same amount of revenue. So that's a very important argument, which Scott doesn't really, you cover it, but you don't cover it in the way that I've just presented it. Now, going back to one of Marianne's questions is, which one of these would you choose? Right? I think you asked that question, Marianne, or I certainly got that question passed on to me through Laurie. Which of these you choose, in a perfect world, it doesn't matter. In a perfect world, you have perfect information, you know what the costs of pollution are, you know what the benefits of cutting back pollution are. So if you know your famous Gaussian diagram, you know the Gaussian cross, you know exactly where to set the price, and you know what the quantity of pollution should be. Okay? The problem is, what if those costs are either abatement costs, that's the cost of cutting back pollution to industry, or you and I as consumers changing our behaviors, or what are the costs to society of pollution? If we don't know those, okay, the problem is, what if you pick the wrong price with a tax, or what if you pick the wrong quantity with your cap and trade? And this is a well-known argument. Marty Weitzman wrote a famous paper in the 1960s in the American Economic Review, and we still go back and cite it and read it. Prices versus quantities. So think about it. A carbon tax is an explicit price. Cap and trade is fixing quantities of pollution, but allowing permits to be traded or auctioned to generate an implicit price. Okay? So if you have perfect information, it doesn't matter. Quantities, prices, you should get the same result. Now, if social costs are uncertain, if you don't know the damages, so if for example, pollution costs, the damages change over time. Okay? They're low one year, they're high the next. The problem with a carbon tax is if costs of pollution are higher than the price you're charging for pollution, you're underestimating the price. And if pollution costs are lower, the price is too high. So the argument there is if there's uncertainty about the costs of pollution, you should use cap and trade. But if there's uncertainty about abatement costs, you should use a tax. And I don't have time to explain the so-called equimarginal principle, but essentially a tax does a better job if you know something about the cost of emissions, but you don't know the cost to the firms abating those emissions. The common view is, and I throw this out not just to be difficult, because you guys are talking about a fee and a dividend system, and I polled all my colleagues who are environmental economists. They all pick cap and trade. And they pick cap and trade on the grounds that it's better to make a mistake on quantity than on price. That seemed to be the standard response that I got from all my environmental economics colleagues. So unlike Scott's model, which is a carbon tax, where you run the risk of getting the price wrong, right? My colleagues would argue there's a lot more uncertainty about social costs. Use cap and trade. It's a lot easier to fix the emissions cap. We can debate that. I'm just throwing that out there just for the good of, just because I'm throwing a hand grenade, I guess. So the common view, it's better to get quantities and not prices wrong. But it's a lot more complex than just trying to fix prices. What really matters, and there's been a huge debate about this, and buried in your model is an implicit or explicit assumption, not just about costs, but about how we discount those costs. Okay, so I'm going to explain this. What do I do? Oh, there we go. A table of numbers. I want you to, I'm not doing this to have a go at Scott. I'm pointing out how the model that Scott has run and lots of other people's models are very sensitive to how you calibrate the tax. So these are numbers that come out of what's known as the Interagency Working Group. So this involves EPA and other agencies in Washington, where they've put together a set of estimates of the social cost of carbon. So these numbers are going forward. So in 2015, right, if you have a relatively high discount rate, what that means is you don't value the damage caused to people in 2050 that much. Okay? So what that says is, in 2015, a metric ton of carbon dioxide causes social costs of $11, right? So in principle, what does that say? If you believe the social discount rate is 5%, you believe this number, your carbon tax should be $11. So Scott, you're about the right starting point. Yep, $10. And then you notice that number goes up, because what you're saying is if you continue to emit a ton of carbon this year, and you continue to emit that same another ton of carbon in 2020, you're now causing more damage to the future, right? Because we need to cut back carbon emissions now to reduce damages tomorrow. That price of that damage goes up to $12. And you'll notice these estimates at a 5% discount rate, which is where you're saying you value today's consumption more than tomorrow, right? Only goes up to $19. Scott's policy gets you up to $200, okay? So Scott's model, if you believe the interagency estimates and you believe this discount rate, you are massively overestimating the social cost of emissions. Agreed? I mean,
I would debate. I would say, first of all, that what I'm putting in the system is not meant to be benchmarked to a social cost.
Right.
We'll talk about this afterwards, obviously. But yes.
Yep. Now, if you lower the discount rate, what lowering the discount rate means is you're saying, I value tomorrow's costs more than I do with a 5% discount rate. And this is the whole debate, right? We're thinking about how much do we weight future generations in decisions we make today. So the lower the discount rate, that means the more you care about people in the future. So it's about intergenerational concerns about the cost of carbon emissions. So straight away you can see, lower it all the way down to 2.5%, and look what happens to that carbon tax. It jumps right up to $57 a ton, but still it only increases to $80 a ton by 2035, still considerably lower than Scott's. If you benchmark Scott's $200 number, right, against social costs, then your carbon tax is considerably higher than what, even at the lowest discount rate would suggest. Now, for there to be truth in advertising, you ought to there's a column I haven't put in this table, but I thought I'd mention it. And that is that these estimates are based on 3 different simulation models. These are well-known climate models. But they're all based upon, you have a distribution of outcomes. You have the social costs won't be quite so bad, and you've got the social costs are going to be really bad. This is a problem, what we call in statistics, the problem of the tails, and how thick the tails. Think of a distribution, right? You got not so bad outcomes over here, and you got really, really bad outcomes over here. If you go up to the 95th percentile, you're in the, this is where Matt Kahn, who's a professor at UCLA, would say you better run for the hills. And a climate change deniers, you can sell your property in Santa Monica Beach to them if they deny climate change, right? It's going to be a really bad outcome. And living in Ohio maybe doesn't look so bad in the middle of winter because you're not going to be under 6 feet of water. So if you go but even if you believe the very worst outcomes are going to happen, you don't get, the tax goes up, the social costs go up to $180. So what I'm getting at here is that any model that you run is going to be very sensitive to what you think the social discount rate is. Of course, you may not believe these estimates. I mean, these estimates have been updated since 2010. So all of my models, I was putting in a $25 per ton carbon tax. That's now gone up, as you can see, to $37 if you use, everybody uses the middle discount rate, typically at 3%. But this is what, when Nick Stern, who's an economist in the UK, wrote a big report for the UK government, he said, we've got to do something about it now, because if we don't, this is sort of the precautionary principle in action. There's going to be huge damages tomorrow. We need to really upfront dealing with carbon emissions. His results were really, really sensitive to the discount rate he chose. It was a very low discount rate, and that's why Nordhaus, who's a very well-known climate economist, Marty Weitzman, had this huge argument at the American Economic Association meetings in 2007 saying, Nick Stern's results are ridiculous. It's all to do with the discount rate. So this is another really good example of, on the one hand, yep, you can use a really low discount rate and you start pushing up the cost of emissions and you start generating much higher taxes, versus somebody else who would say, no, that's not a reasonable discount rate. It's closer to 3 or 4%. Look what happens to the numbers. So I throw this in not to criticize what Scott's done, but to show if you ran some sensitivity analysis on your model, you'd get quite different numbers. I don't suspect, I'm pretty sure you'd get pretty different numbers just because the revenue numbers would be different. Yeah, that's no problem. So let me talk a little bit about what I'm interested in beyond what I've just talked about. Now, again, I polled all my friends who are environmental economists this week. Are we going to get an agreement in Paris this October, I think it is, when the next meeting of the UN, United Nations Convention on Climate Change meets? Given what happened in Bali, I guess it was this fall, I'm not optimistic that we're going to get a global climate agreement. So we're going to continue to see essentially what Scott is modeling, which is unilateral implementation of climate policy. And this means that we as economists have thought a lot more about, well, what happens when you get unilateral or small coalitions set climate policy and you have free riders, countries that don't. Now, public economists were thinking about this in the 1990s, long before this became an issue, and public economists stroke environmental economists said, hey, let's tax imports really highly and subsidize exports really highly. It was a simple argument. You worsen the terms of trade for countries that exported polluting goods. By the terms of trade, I mean the US or a coalition of countries are big enough to affect world prices. So you tax at the border dirty countries, right? What do? You drive down the world price, you provide them with lower incentive to export. You use export subsidies on your exports, that drives down the world price. The problem that public economists themselves recognized, and so did environmental economists, was you can't just do this under WTO law. So the WTO has moved a lot more towards being greener. We talk about greening the WTO, but ultimately the WTO is a very simple institution. It's about the setting of rules on international trade and the resolution of trade disputes. Now, many countries have applied unilateral policies. Australia, until Tony Abbott came to power, had a carbon tax. He got rid of it. Don't ask me why. It didn't seem to make any sense to me. The EU has a system of tradable permits. The one that I found out about very recently, Quebec, a province in Canada, has its own carbon tax, which it implemented starting in 2012. And it prices its permits off the Californian energy market. Scott and I think we talked about this over the phone. Now, unilateral policies usually include some kind of border measure. And actually, Krugman calls them carbon tariffs. They're not tariffs. They're border tax adjustments, and I'll explain that. You might think that's semantics, but it's not. It's actually a very important legal point. Now, the logic of border measures, Scott's already explained. It's about preventing carbon leakage. The way I always describe this to my students is like you go to the county fair and you know that thing where you hit the gopher over the head with a hammer. What happens? The gopher pops up somewhere else. So think of hitting the gopher over here as unilateral policy in the US, and the gopher coming up somewhere else as other countries around the world not having a climate policy or having weaker climate policy. This is the classic, what we call the pollution haven hypothesis. It's well understood in environmental economics. And at the same time, you have this problem that if you unilaterally tax firms in the US, you lose competitiveness. Now, nobody knows what competitiveness means. I'm a trade economist, and I can't tell you. Right? It's a really fuzzy concept. Typically, industries understand it, but trade economists don't talk about competitiveness. We talk about comparative advantage. Now, would it be legal? Now, I've actually spent a fair amount of my time reading the literature and thinking about this. Is it WTO legal? Well, there's a well-understood principle in economics called destination-based taxation. And the reason the WTO recognizes this concept in principle is that when the European Union was formed, it implemented value-added tax. Now, a value-added tax system is a system of what we call destination-based taxation. The highest point of value added in the system is where the tax is levied, and everybody else back up the chain gets a rebate. Okay? The EU, when it implemented VAT, there's 17% VAT in Europe. When goods are imported into the EU, they get charged 17% VAT. That is a border tax adjustment. It's an adjustment for a domestic tax. So think carbon tax is a domestic tax. In principle, you can have a border tax adjustment. So under the VAT system, you tax at 17% at the border and you rebate at 17% when you export. So next time you go to the UK, sneak round the corner at Heathrow Airport and you can get back all your VAT on all the goods you bought. It's a border tax adjustment, and you have that in your model, I know. Now, the WTO rules allow for border tax adjustments as long as they are neutral in terms of their trade effects. They cannot be used as protectionist devices. Okay? In other words, you can't target the Chinese in a discriminatory way with a higher border tax than the carbon tax just because you don't like the fact they pollute more carbon than we do. That would be trade distorting and would definitely violate the WTO rules. The problem we have with what's going on with carbon, and I'll just wrap up, electricity, you have that in your model, being taxed quite appropriately, is typically a non-traded good. we don't trade electricity. I mean, typically we don't. We have some cross-border trade between the US and Canada. We have regional trade in the US, and I think the British buy nuclear power from the French, even though we don't like nuclear power. But it comes under the channel. We don't generate it. It's the French who have to worry about their nuclear power plants blowing up, even if we're downwind of them, right? So electricity is not traded, but many, many goods embody electricity. So you have a lot of energy-intensive goods. And the issue at the WTO, which we don't know the way the WTO would rule, is do goods that embody an electricity, show me a piece of steel where you can find electricity in it. Right? It's not an input, you can't, it was used to produce it, but it's not embodied in the good. So there's going to be a huge debate about whether you can tax imports of steel or aluminum at the border because they use electricity which is being taxed with a carbon tax. Now, aluminum production also would emit CO2, but it's mostly indirect emissions of CO2 come out of the aluminum industry. So, very quickly, the possible effect of border tax adjustments is, this is where I would disagree with what you've done, Scott, based upon the political economy, and that is very few industries are going to be given a border tax adjustment. The Waxman-Markey bill picked on steel and 4 other industries: aluminum, paper, cement, and chemicals. And the Europeans have picked on the same set of industries. What's interesting about those industries, most of our imports come from Canada, not from China. Just I throw that one out there. So trade neutrality implies that any policy you put in place at the border should maintain imports of that energy-intensive good at the level that they were prior to implementation of the climate policy. You can't use it in a discriminatory way. So my work, we found that WTO-compliant border tax adjustments solve the leakage problem. They solve it, but they don't solve the competitiveness problem. What they tend to do is actually facilitate collusion, because these industries where they're typically going to be applied are very concentrated. Aluminum has been busted by the US antitrust authorities at least 5 times in my knowledge. The problem is you run the risk of taxing American firms and Canadian firms, and they actually start competing less efficiently with each other. And so what you have an unintended consequence of the policy. You solve one market failure, pollution, and you create another, you generate monopoly power. This is a well-known result that Tulloch and Buchanan thought about in the 1950s. And I'll finish there. Thanks very much for your attention.
All right. I would like to have a few minutes to have the panel talk amongst themselves, and it sounds like we do have the one hand, other hand situation. So I'd like to, I guess, invite Scott to respond a bit, and then Ian to have some discussion as well. I'd like to keep that phase to about 10 minutes. If you guys run out of steam, I've got a couple of questions that I can add. But I do want to have a little time for the audience to talk to the panelists as well. So, Scott, why don't you pick up the discussion from there?
Sure. He mentioned several times, obviously, in that if you poll, environmental economists or ecological economists, they definitely say go with a cap and trade. But I hang into a different circle, quote unquote, run with a different crew, and I mostly spend my time around macroeconomists and tax and fiscal economists, and they tell me the exact opposite, actually. That if you address this as a economic or a fiscal or an environmental issue, or a non-environmental issue, is primarily a macro issue, that it should be addressed with taxes. And there's several reasons that they would, in some cases, favor a tax-based system over some sort of quota or cap and trade or whatever allowance system is, some sort of system there. And just to go through a couple of these is that, yes, and there's couple people in the audience that have brought this up, is this system that CCL proposed. It's not my idea, it's their idea. I just scored it as I saw it written, quote unquote. I'm using the CBO excuse here. I'm taking current legislation and just taking it as it is. But the social cost of carbon to what they're doing is actually, I'm not saying an irrelevant point, but to an extent it's really not anything they're doing is based on this. Because the issue isn't so much looking at those numbers up there, and I'm not going to accept or reject, I'll accept them just as an intellectual exercise, the numbers that they're giving. They're certainly better equipped to answer it as mine, but let's just say $50 or $25 to $50 is our range. That $25 or $50 number is typically it's a worldwide number, correct? It's looking at the whole world's cost of this.
It's a global public bad, so
Right.
you have to price it as a global public
Right.
bad.
So it's a global price. And theoretically, what you'd want to do, if you could do anything in theory, like optimal policy design, like a benevolent dictator for a day, is you put on this uniform price throughout the entire world, and you'd rebate the money, and here's the real hard part about it, is you would rebate the money perfectly through whatever means to the people that would actually be the ones having the disbenefits. So to use Coase's example here, for those of you who've done the welfare economics on this, train comes down the track, the sparks come off the train, and start the fields on fire for the local farmers. In that case, it's pretty easy to see the local farmers, give them the recompense from the railroad that you've either taxed or quoted from them, and go on your merry way. The problem with this is the disbenefits that the social cost of carbon is meant to compensate are people that are literally all over the world. A lot of, and I'm not a great expert on this, but it's my understanding a lot of those who would suffer the most are typically low-income people. And by low income, I do not mean American poor, I mean worldwide poor, China, India, Africa, South America, who live in large, cluttered metropolitan areas like a Lagos or a Buenos Aires or Rio de Janeiro or Shanghai that are up against waterways or up against the sea. There's no way for the United States to recompense them with our fiscal policy. It's impossible. Trying to design a perfect situation where we tax the entire world perfectly and rebate everybody based on their actual disbenefit, based on what the property rights failure is for them, is impossible. And trying to design a system at the United States level that would do that, when the United States is what, like 15% of world emissions? I don't remember the exact number, but it's in that range. Reducing American emissions does have an appreciable effect on the world, but again, it's a global issue. We all own it, none of us own it. So talking about the social cost of carbon here seems to be kind of mistaking the theoretical optimal policy design that unless a Paris or a Lima or any of these others can go someplace, and I don't think those are remotely close in most instances, as an intellectual exercise, it makes perfect sense, but it has no real bearing on the immediate policy or politics that's going on. So CCL is abandoning, and I'm not trying to speak for you all here, but my opinion as an economist, but they're abandoning any benchmark of their price to the social cost of carbon simply because that's not what they're looking to doing. The other point too is, and this is a parameter debate, we could do this all day long, but one of the big results in my result set there is, remember the blue for coal? When the coal plants go away, that's where a lot of the benefit in the system comes out in terms of carbon dioxide reductions because it's replaced by wind and solar and storage, and then also in air quality benefits because the coal plants are the source of a lot of the mercury and chromium and stuff that cause these issues. That happened in our system, and it's a system that has foresight. It sees future prices. That happened about $70 to $100 a ton. And that means that the system obviously is not continuous. There's a point where this type of power starts beating this type of power. And that happens higher than any of the social cost of carbons that I saw above. So just a very practical standpoint, we could talk to utility economists or electrical engineers all day long, but if one of the major benefits is the remaking of the power sector to maybe not entirely in the renewables, but at least remove the coal plants and replace them with an all of the above, that isn't high enough, quote unquote. And then remember, that's $70 a ton with the model seeing that prices are going to keep going up in the future. Plants last decades. Theoretically, you could have a nuclear plant that could last a century. So the model's using that foresight and making that decision in the 2020s at $70 and up. The other point I'd make too is that businesses, a cap and trade does not give you an assured price. The price can fluctuate. Look at what's happened to Reggie and AB 32 in California. The auction prices have fluctuated greatly month to month based on demand for emissions, essentially. There's nothing that business people, be it MBAs or engineers running plants, hate more than uncertainty. Having a known price coming down the pipeline, and in this case a very simple one, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, is a benefit in terms of their planning, and also for that matter the political appeal. The viability of this is that we're not going to try and hide this with a cap, and the price is just going to kind of come out as it is. And I agree completely with your theoretical constraint that theoretically one is picking a price and letting the market pick a quantity. One is picking a quantity and letting the market pick a price. It's the same thing in the end. But the practicality of what that does amongst decision makers who have to make huge capital investment decisions that will in some cases last years if not decades, you're making their job harder if you do a quantity. And the other issue too is that there's a pre-existing market for energy in North America. I'll use North America specifically. It's similar throughout the world, but specifically in North America. Somebody pulls it out of the ground and they sell it to a pipeline or a railroad. They're going to move it. They're going to sell it to a refiner. The refiner is going to sell it to a product pipeline. The product pipeline is going to sell it to a wholesaler. They're going to sell it to retailers. They're going to sell it to you, me, our employers, everything else. There's an existing market supply chain, and energy markets are incredibly complicated, and there's a dozen layers there. But there's an existing supply chain and market chain that everybody already understands and already interacts with. It's one that generated itself, quote unquote, organically. Ever since Spindletop, Texas, the market has generated an energy industry and markets that are used layer to layer to layer to exchange commodities to eventual consumption. Putting the market, and obviously it's a missing market argument, but the market didn't see, because the externality is not taken account of, the need to have a layer in there of, well, let's price the carbon, let's trade the carbon. It didn't see the need for it. And we're basically supposing to build an extra layer into a market that works fairly well. Like one of the most efficiently run, complicated, complex market systems in the world is the North American energy market, for that matter. We're basically saying we're going to put another layer into that the market itself saw no reason to exist. I just argue that it's much simpler to just put an excise tax somewhere in there. That's what a carbon price is. It's an excise tax.
Got it. If I could interrupt you, just wrap it up.
This last point. Put that excise tax in, which we've had excise taxes since the Acadians. Seem to work for them. Most of our other energy taxes in North America, be it the gas tax, surcharges on severance taxes and the like, are excise taxes. They tend to work. They're simple.
And Ian, feel free to have a response, but if you could keep it brief, that'd be excellent.
Let me put my trade economist hat on, because that's what I really am, as opposed to an environmental economist. And that is that trade economists have understood for a long time that a tariff, let's think of that as the carbon tax, is a very transparent policy. It's easy to understand, which is, I think, what you're arguing, and I don't disagree with that at all. And a quota is often very opaque, and voluntary export restraints are even more opaque. This is where you tell the public, oh, the Japanese agreed not to export any more cars to the US. And we all go, that's a really good idea, forgetting, of course, that the price of cars still goes up. So there's a lot to be said for transparency. And the problem with the cap and trade system, this is where I argue with my environmental economics friends, is that if you have a system where you're regularly giving out permits, possibly either maybe not free, but it's certainly lower than a price that would exist in an auction market, you generate what economists call rents. So the rent is the difference between how somebody values a permit and how much they have to pay for it. So supposing in a market trading system, a permit comes out at $10 a ton of CO2 that you're allowed to produce, that you have to pay to produce. But you only have to pay the government $5 for it. It generates what we call rents. That's the difference between $5 and $10. Now, in a static world, we don't care about rents because we wake up one day, we get the permit, we pollute, and we're dead tomorrow. But with a political cycle, if you have rents, money to be made in the system, polluting firms have an incentive to lobby the government to keep this permit system in place because they're getting rents from it. The beauty of a carbon tax is there are no rents to be sought.
I will say that technically there's no rents on the tax itself, but there are certainly rents to be made on the redistribution of the funds. But that's also a problem.
I'm just talking about the policy instrument designed to most efficiently reduce carbon emissions as opposed to what you do with the revenues from, obviously there's rent seeking when you've got revenues to hand out. So, yes, the reason environmental economists argue in favor of cap and trade is simply, it's the issue of which is most uncertain. Is it social costs of emissions or is it abatement costs? And I think they've gone with the cap and trade for that reason. I think there's a good political economic reasons why they go with cap and trade, and that it's in this country you can't mention taxes, that's a dirty word, right? And even John McCain, if you go back to the 2008 election, he was a sponsor of at least 2 climate bills. I forget which other politician, the Democrat who became an independent.
Was it the Vermont guy?
No,
Or Jeffords was?
Lieberman.
Lieberman.
Yeah,
McCain Lieberman.
Lieberman and McCain were both involved in a climate bill, and I think they proposed a carbon tax. But during the presidential election, McCain made the claim that carbon taxes were cap and trade was nothing like a carbon tax. Clearly not understanding that if a cap and trade system worked the same way as a climate tax, they should have exactly the same effects. They raise prices in some sense. But I think it's probably easier to sell cap and trade for political reasons. Plus, by giving away permits for free, this is like a bribe to industry to accept climate policy because they simply incur abatement costs. So I think we can go round and round the houses on this one, and
Well, I want to interject my own expertise just slightly. So I'm an ecologist, and I'm familiar with modeling of complex systems. Often, what we will do is, run a model, and then we'll do experiments to see how well the results match the model. So I'm curious: are there existing carbon tax or cap and trade systems that each of you think works rather well, or you think is a particular set of results that we can use to inform future policy that's going on in the world right now? Or has happened and you think, now there's a model, there's a policy, if we were to expand upon that, that would be particularly effective? Or perhaps an experiment of this particular carbon tax model that CCL has proposed. Is there anything happening at a small scale that would be interesting?
He's, of course, going to have the international covered much better than me. I'm very much an Americanist, as most of you can probably tell here. But there is one analog in the North American continent that's been active for a while that is not perfect to what CCL is talking about, but British Columbia, so Vancouver, West Coast Canada, has had a carbon tax. It's $30 a ton Canadian, which is basically $30 a ton American. And they've had it since '07, I believe. It slowly ratcheted up. I think it peaked its tax rate in 2011 and has been flat since. And this is nice because it's a natural experiment. You have one province in Canada that did something and the rest of Canada has not. Granted, BC's industry mixture and energy sector is different than everyone else, particularly because they don't cover the power sector with their carbon tax, because almost all electricity in British Columbia comes from hydroelectricity, so they don't really have to anyways. But in this paper, it's easy enough to find online, but I can't show it to you. But somebody went through and just decided to do a fun little experiment is, let's look at BC's per capita income or per capita GDP, real per capita income and GDP for that matter, over the last 5, almost getting up to 10 years now, while this carbon tax has been active. And its income relative to the rest of Canada is pretty much the same. There hasn't been any deviation. Like statistically, their economy looks basically the same. Maybe even slightly better, actually. And if you look at its emissions, Canada's emissions as a whole, it's kind of a frowny face because it declined during the recession and then has recovered since. Same thing in this country for that matter. The macroeconomy does affect emissions, while British Columbia's has actually declined, relatively speaking, about 10% relative to the rest of Canada's. And they've only put about a 25-cent per gallon tax on gasoline. Granted, there's a million other extraneous factors. This is why econometrics is always complicated. It can be more art than science in some instances. But it's nice to me because I mostly have done state carbon taxes, Massachusetts, Vermont, Washington, California. This national one is a big featurette, but fundamentally REMI is a regional system and a regional modeling group. British Columbia's results of almost statistically indistinguishable macro results with a reduction of emissions of small double-digit percent-wise is pretty much what I've been getting. So there's one instance where maybe the empirical is lining up, at least broadly speaking, what the modeling has come out with.
Well,
what about you? Do you have an example that you would?
Well, the SO2, the sulfur dioxide case was a cap and trade system that worked very successfully. And it did do what I mean, something we haven't, your final slide was a really good example of what you really hope climate policy will do, which is it provides an incentive to firms to change technology. So you have a decrease in coal-fired energy production, and you substitute it in cleaner forms of energy. And that's the dynamic of this is you hope to provide incentives to innovate or find clean, cheaper ways of abating pollution. And the SO2 trading market did that, in at least as I understand it, and it helped deal with the acid rain problem that, particularly Ohio was affecting Canada with acid rain. I'm not so even though I'm from Europe, I don't follow the EU permit trading system, and we were talking a little bit about this over dinner earlier. My initial reaction to the Quebec model is one where all electricity production you have to purchase permits in a cap and trade model. They're not auctioned, but I think they're pricing it off the Californian market, which makes perfect sense. And in the case of aluminum, the way they're dealing with the competitiveness problem in Quebec is Quebec can't set trade policy. It's a province. The Canadian government sets trade policy. So in the case, what they're doing there is aluminum producers and it gets slowly ratcheted down. So aluminum is 25% of their costs are through energy, electricity. You smelt alumina to make aluminum, essentially. And aluminum producers in Canada who export at least 70% of their output to the US market will get initially about 80% of their permits are free, and then they gradually have to buy more permits over a period of time. What's interesting about my own research from Canada is that you mentioned British Columbia. Quebec is also, out of the 13 aluminum plants in Canada, 12 are located in Quebec. And Quebec is all hydro. And so I'm trying to use my French-Canadian accent here, I guess. Quebec. Vive Quebec, I think de Gaulle said when he went. So what I found in my own research was you actually got negative leakage when we ratcheted up a climate tax here in the US. So you don't get yes, production moves to Canada of aluminum, but because emissions are so much lower in Canada, because they use hydro, and they actually have cleaner aluminum production we do here in the US, the leakage thing is not an issue. In fact, you get a sort of double policy dividend, which is we lower emissions in the US, and we get lower global emissions because Canada's has lower carbon emissions in the first place. But I think that's just a sort of peculiar result that you get out of the aluminum sector. Now, that doesn't deal that, American aluminum companies aren't going to be too happy about jobs being exported to Canada. But what's interesting is the industry is dominated by two multinationals, both based in the US and Canada. Rio Tinto, Alcan, and Alcoa, which is an American company. So the aluminum case is kind of interesting. And we don't have to worry about China right now. China's mostly in the recycling, what they call the secondary aluminum market, which is really, really dirty in China, but they don't export to the US.
Thank you very much. I would like to, we're going to end by 9 o'clock, and I'd like to have some time for audience questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, if we could bring a microphone down front, and then we have someone in red. Please wait for your microphone. Alice, I'll see you. We'll do Lee and then Alice.
There's a big elephant in the room. You're totally ignoring it. It's the power of oil. If you haven't read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, you're missing the game. The decisions are going to be made not in nice academic discussions about modeling. It's going to be made in powers of decision makers who are the powers. And that's where the action has to be. We all know it's coming, but the modeling can be subject to the power of politics. And behind all of this is our whole economic system itself. It's very extractive, exploitive. If you don't believe me, read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything.
One of you like to take that?
Broadly speaking, we could do an entire another one of these. Oh, sorry. Broadly speaking, we could do an entire another one of these on just the politics of this. Obviously, I talked about one specific idea, which is CCLs run through a macro model with a power model integrated into it, and what this would mean. And obviously, Ian here talked about what are some of the international trade implications of this in terms of legal and economic theory. The politics of this are not simple. They're not simple for anything in this country. We have a lot of issues we have to deal with, to say the least, in terms of entitlement, our tax system, the optimal mixture of tax and spend, and a very large demographic change that's about to wash this country in a way it never has been before. We're about to go into a declining population growth. We've never had that before, really. Yes, you're right, oil is powerful, but let's not forget that oil companies are fundamentally businesses. They're publicly traded, they are seeking profit. They're, in that sense, very predictable. Exxon has a carbon price internally and is anticipating it. The biggest oil consumer in the United States is the Department of Defense, and they are actually planning on having a future carbon price and are trying to get themselves off of it because they're frankly sick of buying stuff from the people that don't necessarily like us very much in a lot of instances. After DoD, the biggest oil consumer in the United States, I believe, is the Union Pacific Railroad. Same deal. The biggest airline in the United States is Delta, based out of Atlanta. They have an internal carbon price. These industries are definitely aware of these issues, and they are including some internal carbon prices. It's actually been my experience in Washington, D.C., that of the industries of coal, natural gas, and oil, the biggest resistance is actually from the coal industry, not from oil and natural gas.
I'd like to make sure we get some questions, so Alice, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Sheldon. Does the U.S. Department of Agriculture have a stance on, number one, climate change, and number two, on how to address, have they addressed the issue of the tax versus cap and trade?
USDA, let me think. If the Waxman-Markey bill had gone through Congress and had been signed by the president, agriculture would probably have been, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who's from the farming sector in the audience, if I remember rightly, would have been paid for sequestering carbon. So if you had put forests on your land or you were sequestering carbon, so I think the argument was if you took livestock agriculture out, which is probably a net emitter of greenhouse gases, agriculture would have actually benefited from climate policy through subsidies for, so you're being paid to sequester carbon. I don't think the Department of Agriculture takes a position either on climate change or whether there should be cap and trade or a tax. I think the way USDA dealt with this is if we had a carbon tax or cap and trade, how would this affect agriculture? And I think the argument was that agriculture would have been a net beneficiary. I don't remember the numbers. These guys over here are nodding their heads, but there would have been incentives to maybe plant more land to forestry or grasses that can be used for and biofuels or whatever. I mean, the debate about the carbon footprint of biofuels is not as simple as you might think. I mean, a lot of my environmental economics colleagues will tell me that they're actually net contributors to carbon emissions, but I don't want to open up that can of worms. I'm not an expert on that.
And I won't give the full answer now to give more time for questions, but agriculture is part of our model, and there's some interesting results there. For those of you who are curious about it, I'll be here afterwards. I'm happy to talk about it.
I think we have a question in the very back.
Hi, yes, this is a question for Dr. Sheldon. This is about carbon tax versus cap and trade, and you mentioned the Waxman-Markey bill of 2010, which got defeated at that point. And that was also right when kind of the whole climate denial counter movement really got going in full force. For people interested, there's a Frontline episode called Climate of Doubt that covers this really well. So I guess my question is, in terms of cap and trade, maybe like theoretically it might be better, but could we say that we've been there and this country has been there and they rejected that? So is there an argument for trying the carbon tax now, or at least framing it as a carbon fee, because Waxman-Markey did go down in defeat.
I don't think Waxman-Markey was defeated because of the policy choice. That's not what I was trying to say. I mean, I'm not a climate scientist, but as somebody who's an academic and reads a lot of research, there is very little respectable peer-reviewed journal articles out there that would support the argument that we don't have climate change. Now, there's a debate about the extent to which it's anthropogenic. Is it caused by human activity, or is it something that's happening anyways? So if you want my sort of personal view, just to see policy in place would be a step forward, be it a climate tax, implementation of EPA standards, or cap and trade. The debate about cap and trade was a political one. It had nothing to do with the economic logic. The arguments for cap and trade are just about what's uncertain in the variables you're trying to measure on which to base the policy. And that's what we're sort of, I mean, Scott brings another side into this, which is the tax implications of having a carbon tax. To my mind, that's not the issue. The issue is getting people to understand, if you believe the climate science, that you need to do something about it. And my discussion about the discount rate is, how fast do you want to do something about it? So if you ratchet it up really fast, it means you care about future generations, be it a tax or ratcheting down the cap, right? That's exactly the same thing, right, in principle. Or do you care about, the faster you raise it, this is a very regressive tax. And it has the potential for, and Scott talks about it in his report, is it has the potential to really hurt low-income people who have less ability to switch into fuel-efficient cars, or there's lack of public transport here in the US. I mean, if you go to Europe, one reason we can bear much higher green taxes is we have a much better public transport system in place, which of course is heavily subsidized by the government. I mean, we could put a congestion tax into London, right? Why? Because we have a perfectly functioning red bus system and an underground system, and in fact, travel times on the buses went down appreciably when the congestion tax was put in place. So I think it's down to what, in a sense, it's back to what you were saying. It's all about politics, right? And if you put in charge of the Senate Environmental Committee a acknowledged climate denier, and I'll just throw that out there. Although there's hope. I mean, I apologize to anybody in the room as a climate change denier, but I noticed 15 senators, last month the Democrats brought it up for a vote in the Senate, and I think 15 senators did vote and agreed that climate change was occurring. They didn't agree on whether it was anthropogenic, but that just to agree that it's occurring seemed to be a break, as somebody who believes in climate science. But as I said earlier, there's a professor at UCLA called Matt Kahn, and he's a great believer in we should adapt, not mitigate climate change. And he said, guys, if you're a climate change denier, please buy my beachfront property on Santa Monica Beach or North Carolina. And the rest of us will run for the hills.
And I'll say back to that one quickly too, is that this entire issue has been broached as, first and foremost, it's an environmental issue. To believe in doing anything, you have to accept the science that it's man-made, or that's happening, that it's man-made, and it's a net cost for humanity, nationally and worldwide. Maybe the solution, and maybe not in literal sense, but in the rhetorical sense, is stop going through the science committee and start going through Ways and Means, and start going through Senate Finance. Reframe the issue as tax reform, reframe the issue as budget reform, welfare reform. There's all sorts of other approaches. That this is a fundamental budget issue. It's $500 billion a year in the numbers that I got here. He can shake his head. It is going to be a budgetary issue. The numbers are too large. It is too deep into our economy.
It's a market failure issue, and there may be a double dividend. Two-handed economists again.
I did allow, I'm going to allow one final question and then we will wrap up. So please go ahead.
Okay, this question is for Scott.
Sorry.
So in your model, jobs are increased, and I'm wondering if that's solely based on the different sources of energy, coal, okay.
That actually is a very, sorry to interrupt, is that the extent of your question?
Yeah, I just was wondering what kind of jobs, not just energy jobs, or, how did you come to the conclusion that jobs will be increased?
Okay. The primary reason, this actually is not changes in the energy sector so much, because the energy sector is actually pretty small. It's not that many jobs. It's, again, depending on how you count, anywhere from 1 to 2 million. And yes, there are more jobs in, say, Nebraska and Iowa to build wind farms and things like that, but it's really not that many. Most of the jobs you're seeing up there is because if you have a certain commodity being consumed, and that's oil, gas, and coal, that's mostly consumed and produced through capital means. It's equipment, it's stuff, it's physical inputs. And now we're shifting consumption into a more general consumer basket through this dividend. That general consumer basket is spent on housing, healthcare, finance, entertainment, vehicles, food, and that just requires more human hands as a matter of production. So it's increasing the capital intensity of the American economy. It's also implicitly decreasing the productivity of the same. It's also decreasing hourly wages in some senses as well. But that's why you're getting more jobs. You're getting them throughout the general economy because there's just more jobs created there because of the type of activity taking place.
Can I just jump in there?
Yes, please.
I do know in your model, I mean, I don't want to talk about your model in any detail. I think there's an agglomeration economy result in there that drives some of that job growth. So you get an employment multiplier, and you get what they call agglomeration effects, where if you have enough firms in a city, you get these beneficial spillovers. And I think some of your results are driven by that.
On some small margin.
Right.
Basically what he's saying is that there's so many breakthroughs in Silicon Valley because there's so many smart people there. And you pile them on each other and they just start coming up with smart ideas exponentially. What he's saying is we're slightly increasing that effect in our model, and that's part of where it's coming from.
But I wanted to make a general point about, and this is not about Scott's model in particular, because I'm as guilty of this, we all do this. We build models where, to use statistical language, we believe the model we've built, right? And then in statistical lingo, it's a maintain hypothesis. You're not testing the null against some alternative, right? So you believe the model and you're just hitting it. So you parameterize this model and you shock it. And computable general equilibrium models do this. Little models that I build do this, the kind of model that these guys do. And it's true of all the climate change models, by the way. All the climate forecasting models, they believe the model, they have all the feedback effects, and they hit it with a shock, and you generate these results. Now, if you're doing proper statistical analysis, you're testing the model that you've built, right? And if you test the model you build, you generate what we call standard errors. In other words, you're able to generate some estimate of the confidence about your results. So these kinds of models are very sensitive to the way you build the model, the way you parameterize the model, and the way you shock the model. And you can do all the sensitivity analysis you like on these kinds of models. You can use fancy Monte Carlo experiments, blah, 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 blah. You still can't generate any statistical confidence in your estimates. And so this is a criticism of all what we call black box. You've got a black box, you don't know how the model works as an outsider, and you can't place any statistical confidence in the results. I mean, this is not peculiar to Scott's model. This is true of all these kinds of forecasting models.
The great irony with that is, like he said a second ago, is a lot of the climate science, is my understanding, basically derives from the same modeling techniques that I'm using just from a macro standpoint. So, you're all caring about this issue with the same pratfalls he just articulated. Exact same set of pratfalls. Though, if anything, maybe the most important result that I got more than anything else is, say the sensitivity of my model to the economy is reasonable. Most of the results I'm getting, as you saw up there, are like 0.25% to 1% changes. It's a very small shock against the whole size of the economy. Maybe the biggest impact or biggest takeaway from something like this is it actually doesn't make much a difference economically. Obviously, every lost job is a tragedy. We don't want any. But over 20 years, to get a change that is statistically indistinguishable from zero, When the opposition to this kind of stuff talks about it in apocalyptic terms, their point isn't, oh, this would have a slight negative effect, or this, we don't really statistically know what this would do. Their point is that this would devastate or destroy the economy. And the results that, not just me, other macroeconomists, Stanford does stuff like this, there's other professors that have research projects, there's macro models that have done these things. They've basically all come up with the same conclusion. It actually doesn't make much of a net difference either way. That's maybe one of the important takeaways of this, is it actually doesn't matter, which may sound like, oh, that's not what we want good stuff. But considering what you're arguing against.
Well, that's a great place to wrap it up. I'd like to thank our two panelists for their really interesting information. And if anyone would like to approach with a couple of questions you didn't get to answer, feel free to do so. Thank you and have a great evening.